What's it like to go virtual with your business and your speaking for the first time? Listen into my conversation with Dr. Bibi Pirayesh on this episode of the Speaking Your Brand podcast. More and more women are making an impact by starting businesses, running for office, and speaking up for what matters. With my background as a TV political analyst, entrepreneur, and speaker, I interview and coach purpose-driven women to shape their brands, grow their companies, and become recognized as influencers in their field. This is Speaking Your Brand, your place to learn how to persuasively communicate your message to your audience. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Speaking Your Brand podcast. I'm your host, Carol Cox. With everything that's been going on with the coronavirus, with the pandemic, a lot of our lives and our businesses have been upended. And this has especially been the case for businesses that have done almost all of their work or all of their work in person, not virtually. And this has been the case for one of the women who was in our Master Your Speaking program earlier this year, Dr. Bibi Pirayesh. She is an educational therapist in the Los Angeles, California area. And when she works with students, she works with them in person because that's an important component of the work that she does with them. But when the school system shut down in March in California, she was left trying to figure out how to go virtual with her business and also how to go virtual with her speaking by doing webinars and virtual events. So we talk about how Bibi has done this, what have been the lessons that she took out of it, and what have been the blessings, the surprising positives that have come out of this that she had not expected at all. This episode is practical, but we also get into a deeper conversation around social justice and education, which is at the heart of Bibi's signature talk. And I wanted her to talk about this on the episode because I find it so fascinating. And it really is a conversation that is not only about education, but about the broader systems in our society and how people who don't fit the mold are often the gifts that are given to us to recognize when systems aren't working, not just for them, but for all of this. So I do hope you enjoy our conversation. Now, let's get on with the show. Welcome to the podcast, Bibi.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We are going to talk today about what happens when you have one type of business and you need to very quickly change it to a different type of business model and delivery, which has happened to, I'm sure, quite a number of the listeners out there. So Bibi, tell us what it is that you do in your business, and then we'll talk a bit about how you've done that traditionally, and then what has happened over the past couple of months.
Sure. So I work as an educational therapist, and I work primarily with children who have different kinds of learning challenges. So my work it's therapeutic and it's also educational. I do a lot of brain-based training, remediation, essentially private one-on-one work with kids with different kinds of learning needs. They might be dyslexic or have ADHD. Occasionally I work with students who are on the autism spectrum. So that's my work in a nutshell. And I work very closely with families. I travel to homes, and I also see clients at my office and I've been in private practice for about almost 15 years now.
And your work has been done in person, as you mentioned. So you're going to clients' homes or they're coming to you in your office. And I'm sure just at the nature of the work that you do and working with children, number one, but then working with children with learning challenges, I'm sure being in person is a big help and a big component of the work that you do with them.
It's actually essential. So one of the principles of working with kids with different kinds of learning challenges is to really work in a multimodal way. And so that tactile component and being in person is hugely important. And then, of course, for kids who have attentional issues, being in the same space with them it's crucial to the work that we do. So I know that there have been, people, and over the years, many people had recommended to me, with traffic and, how much we have to pay for office space and all that, to think about possibly doing virtual work. And I was always 100% against it because I didn't feel that would be the same quality of work. So So yeah, and then, COVID-19 happened and completely changed everything.
Yes, it forced a lot of constraints that we had no control over. And you live in the Los Angeles, California area. And I know that California went into a stay-at-home order pretty early compared to at least a lot of the states, even on the East Coast of the United States, because you all started mid-March.
We did. So we went in pretty early. And in the beginning, we just kept thinking, oh, it's just for a couple weeks, maximum 1 month. And so I was really looking at it as, well, this is a temporary thing. And that's what I was saying to all of my clients. And we're just going to get through. But then they made the announcement where they were going to just close schools for the remainder of the year. And when that hits, everyone in the community was in a panic, including me, because we now knew that this was going to be a long-term. Now the term long-term feels very different. At the time, 2 months felt like, oh my God, how are we going to do this? And now, of course, we're wondering if we're going to have to do all of next year virtually, but we'll see. And so at that point, I really felt like, it was going to require something more than just providing resources or, little bits of advice here and there, and that parents really needed a more concrete, fundamental shift in the way that they're looking at the school year and learning. And that we as professionals had to really make some big shifts as well, because we had to now provide all of these services virtually. And how do you do that? So it was kind of a rough week when that happened. A lot of anxiety and kind of staying up late. But then we all began to accept the new reality and began to make some shifts. And it actually has turned out much better than I thought it was going to turn out.
I think that has happened for a lot of us. I know that initially the mid to late March period, first of all, March was the longest month ever,
yes.
as far as the way that it felt. And I know that they say that the reason that happens is because when you have novel experiences, when you have new experiences, time seems to slow down. That's why as a kid, like when you went through high school, those 4 years felt like they took forever. It felt like a long time because everything's so new, these milestones and things. But when you get to it as being an adult, like every year is almost the same, right? So it goes by really fast. But March was so novel that it felt like forever. And so thinking back to that, Bibi, and then now we're recording this right at the end of April. And you said things have turned out better than what you had anticipated. So when you were first thinking about, I have to figure out what to do with my clients, because obviously you want to support the students, the children that you've been working with. What are some things that you've done? How did you reach out to your parents just on an individual level? And how have you been able to make some shifts in your business to go virtual?
The clients who were already on my roster, I obviously have a very personal relationship with. So we were regularly talking and meeting and all of that. But I also felt just as a member of the community and someone who, I try to really do community work. So I felt that there was a need to reach out to people on a larger scale. And that was one of the reasons that I decided to do a webinar to really get to parents and give them some reassurance and help them plan out how to get through the next few weeks. I think that, the stay-at-home order has been really and the schooling from home has been really difficult for parents in general, obviously, especially if they're working parents. I think that for those who have kids with learning challenges, it's an extra level of difficulty. And so I felt like it was really important to get the word, or at least get some support out to them so that they don't feel completely lost in space. And then a lot of the shifts that we had to make was also in my work with schools, because I work with a lot of different schools, some public, many private, and every school was responding differently. Some schools just immediately were able to make the switch and send kids, schedules, and teachers were doing Zoom sessions all day. And then other schools were just a complete mess and did not know how to respond at all. So figuring out all of those pieces for every single family, every single student, that was a big part of it. But in some ways, and this is something that I talked about in the webinar and something that we as a community and of educators have been talking about, I think that as crazy and difficult as this time has been, it's also been really fertile ground for us to learn about our students with learning challenges. So you mentioned time, for example. Kids with executive function disorders have a very difficult time processing themselves in space and time. So that feeling that we had in March, I think for a lot of them is the feeling that they generally have. And so there's been all these opportunities for us to really be able to put ourselves in the shoes of our students who have these challenges, or even like sort of the level, like the low grade anxiety that we all have all the time right now, I think is something that they experience all the time. So there's been a lot of opportunity, I think, for understanding. And, when I work with a kid around executive function and ADHD, I always insist that it's done in the home, because that's where you really understand how the systems are working or not working. And so in that way, this has also been a great opportunity, because there's no better place to understand executive function than at the home. And now parents are with their child. They're so engaged and involved in the schooling process. They're really able to see what their kids need. And I think that once we come out of this, we're going to be able to take all of these experiences that we learned and use them to advocate for the needs of our students. And I also think that this has been really great in helping schools who generally can be very resistant to the idea of individualized learning and modifications, etc. I think it's been a revolution in a sense, because they have just been doing that, and they're seeing that so much of it works really well, especially for kids with these types of needs. And so now we have all this data and evidence that, these kinds of shifts and changes can be helpful. So there's been a lot that's been really good, but, it's felt like we just got dropped into the deep end, and we all had to figure. And I remember somewhere like towards the end of March, there was a meeting that, educational therapists, they held a virtual meeting for people to come together. And I have never in my life seen so many people log on to. It was hundreds of people just coming together and trying to figure out, like, how do we manage this? How do we do this? And of course, people come to it from different backgrounds. Some people can work virtually really well, have experience with that. Others don't even know what Zoom is. So it's been a big range. And the same is true for parents and kids. It's been a very, very interesting experience and experiments in diversity and in honoring differences, I think.
Yes, Bibi. And I know that this relates to the signature talk that we worked on together a couple of months ago, because you were in our Master Your Speaking program that started in January and just finished up in April. And of course, the idea behind going through the program and creating your signature talk is to go give it at conferences and on stages in person. And we've had to shift a lot of that because there are no in-person events right now. And you mentioned that you did this webinar. So you also went through our Webinar Idea to Launch program. So you didn't use your signature talk for your webinar because didn't make sense for and I want listeners to know that we're going to talk about your signature talk topic because I find it fascinating. It relates to just what you said about diversity of difference. And I love the soapbox, Bibi, that you get on about it because it's so important. So listeners, hang on, because we're going to get to that and you're going to love it. But before we do that, I want to talk about your webinar, because the signature talk topic didn't make sense for the time and the audience that you wanted to reach, because you wanted to help parents practically with some resources that they could use for schooling at home, especially with children with learning challenges. And so you decided to do what I would call a brand awareness webinar. You weren't selling something at the end of the webinar very purposefully. You wanted to, it also was the first webinar you had ever done. So congratulations on putting yourself out there and doing it. And I know being in the program with us, we weren't going to let you not do one. So you had no choice, but you did it. And Diane, their speaking coach, she attended it and she said you did fantastic. And I know that you did. And so doing that webinar and being the first time that you did that, and because your business is not an online business like mine is and a lot of us are, so you don't have this email list, you haven't been nurturing prospective clients or an audience via an email list or social media. How did you go about finding people to attend your webinar? Because I know for a lot of people who are doing a webinar for the first time, one of their concerns is anyone actually going to show up? Because they don't maybe have an audience built in.
Right. Well, I mean, I'll be very honest. So I came into the webinar course thinking that I was going to turn my signature talk into a webinar and then maybe send it out to a few organizations and see if they would be interested. And then when the news hit, I think it was in week 1, about how we were going to basically be off school for the remainder of the year, it just felt like this immediate need. And I knew that I had to respond to that in some way. So then I made the decision to just do it as something separate for the webinar. And honestly, when I first started, I was like, I'm not gonna pay to buy Zoom webinar. I'll just do a regular Zoom because I'm gonna have like 2 people, and one of them will be my cousin. Like, no one's gonna show up to this because I didn't even have. I mean, I had a mailing list, but I don't send out like a newsletter, or I don't have like a regular way. I just have a list of the people who have been clients for a long time or people that I've networked with. So the first thing that I had to do was just to create a mailing list and like get on MailChimp and try to figure that out, which was, for someone like me who's not necessarily very tech savvy, that was in itself very scary. And then my brother recommended, just because he's sort of more tech savvy, he recommended that I find someone on Fiverr to help with that. And so I reached out to someone, and that was a whole experience on its own, because trying to communicate with someone on the other side of the world it was just really a fascinating experience. But somehow I got this mailing list together, and I had about 300 people on it, which was surprising to me. I went back over just first started looking at all of the business cards that I had collected over the years. And then I went through and looked at all of my client lists, and I was like, okay, well, this is a chunk of people. So I put that together, but I was still convinced that nobody was going to show up. I think it was Diane, or maybe it was you, who made the recommendation to reach out to other people that we know. And, I have a very boutique practice, but I have very, the relationships that I have with the people that I have them in the community are very real, and they're relationships that I've nurtured over the years. So that, basically 3 nights before the webinar, it was a Sunday night, I just sat down and I emailed the information to about 10 people on my list that I knew. And I asked them to send it out to their list. And then I put it on my LinkedIn as well and sent it to my own list. Like, that was all I did. And I had purchased the kind of webinar where you can only have up to 100 people register. And I ended up getting 90 people registered.
That's amazing.
Which I could not believe. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I think part of it is also just there really was a need. And I think I intuitively felt that. But, and the people who registered weren't just parents. There were so many professionals who really wanted to learn more about, what do we do right now? And then of the general rule, as you told us, was about maybe a third of the people who register show up. But I had about 50 people who showed up to the
That's
webinar,
great.
which was great. Yeah, it was really great. And then afterwards, it kind of made some sound in the community. I mean, I've had people calling me about it, saying like, "Oh, I heard you did this webinar, and all these people showed up, and it was really great." So it was very surprising. It was very surprising because I was so nervous about it and so convinced that nobody would come. And I put the setting on to get the emails every time somebody registers. And so as they started to trickle in, my anxiety level was going higher and higher, because I was like, oh my God, now I have to do this for all of these real people. And what if my Zoom crashes? And what if it all doesn't work out? So it was nerve-wracking, I'm not going to lie, but I'm so happy that I did it, because when you do it once, I feel like you then just, the second time around, I'm sure I'll have some nerves too, but it's going to be 1,000 times easier.
You know that you can handle it. Whatever comes up,
exactly.
It will be all right. It's funny because the fear at first goes from no one's going to show up to, oh my gosh, look at all these people who are going to show up.
Exactly. That's exactly. I was like, this is bad. I need to postpone it. I don't have enough time. But, it was a very timely thing. So I also couldn't, it wasn't something that I could give myself a lot of time to prepare for. So there were a couple nights when, I was up very late, and, there was anxiety around it. But again, I feel the fact that, I just got thrown into the deep end and had to do it quickly was actually very helpful in getting me out there. Like the just do it part was really, really important.
I agree. Having tight deadlines are often very good, because then you have, even though you may have some late nights, you overall have less time to worry about it.
Exactly.
When it's stretched out. All right. Well, congratulations, Bibi. I'm so glad that you did that. And I know that you're gearing up to do another one once California figures out what they're doing with having kids come back to school, when that's going to be, and then you'll help parents figure that out.
Hopefully, once we know what our orders are, we'll figure out a way to follow them and get through in a way that hopefully is beneficial for kids who have these types of challenges. So, yeah.
Let's talk now about your signature topic, Bibi, as we promised a few minutes ago. And what I would like for you to do, if you're up to it, is to talk about one of your students, one of your clients. And this is how we opened your talk. And I think that it does such a great job of illustrating the point that you end up making in your signature talk.
Sure. So when you work as an educational therapist, a lot of your clients tend to be private clients because, it's a private practice model. The particular student came to me, he was in second grade at the time, and he did not know his alphabet, could not recognize any of the letters, had a pretty severe, what we call an auditory processing, a sound processing disorder. And he was at this very progressive school where they, prided themselves on really being there for every student and wanting to educate every student, but without any real understanding of learning differences or learning disorders or learning challenges. And so when we first started, I had a lot of pushback about the changes that I was asking for him. It was difficult. I got lucky only because his parents were very much supportive. And in a way, it ended up transforming the school. And I think that's one of the gifts that kids with different kinds of learning challenges or just differences in general bring to us. They come to us and they insist and they require and they force us to think differently and to widen our lens and to try to understand something that we wouldn't otherwise understand. And I think that by doing that, they make us better learners, better educators, better people. In that way, I really do see learning difference as a social justice issue. And, then obviously sort of in other ways, I think that how we treat difference in our school system is hugely important. So one of the things that came up as the stay-at-home order was going on was the question of, well, are schools still required to function under IDEA and provide the modifications and accommodations that students with learning differences get to have? And there was talk with the Secretary of Education about not doing that because, how would schools do that virtually? And we shouldn't place that burden on them. But so many of us in the field were very worried because when there is a precedent, so when there's a time where they don't honor something like that, then it's going to be really, really difficult to get those rights back. Really, there's a lot of politics obviously involved and economics involved, but luckily in the end, the decision was that all of those laws were going to remain in place and that schools would still be required to provide those services. Now, how they are going to do that is a different question. And I think that's part of what those of us who are working in the community have to work to help the schools be able to do as well, because a lot of them do want to, but they don't really know how best to do that and how do you do that virtually. But then at the same time, I do think that this is also an unprecedented time in which we can try out different new models when it comes to inclusion and diversifying and kind of changing the way that we teach. So a lot of good and bad. It's sort of one of those types of times, and we have to be on the side of the good and support that and fight for that. So yeah, there's a lot of social justice issues going right now with this virtual learning stuff.
I can imagine. And like you said earlier, it's about experimenting, and what they end up doing could end up helping a lot more students, even than they originally anticipate having an impact on. And one part of your talk, Bibi, that really struck me when we were working on it was this idea that what if we saw these students who have learning challenges, learning differences, what if we saw these students as a gift instead of a problem, that they are the clue to the solution. And this is where I was thinking about whatever end up accommodations or things that we help them with, especially when it comes to virtual learning, it could end up helping a bunch of other students as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, so for example, one thing that we're doing now without even meaning to is what we call self-paced learning. So, this is something that those of us who work with this population have been fighting for a long time, because kids, process and progress at different rates. And there's always been pushback against that. Like, no, this is the curriculum, this is the test, this is the time, you can't. And when you do that, you actually prevent mastery, because kids are not going to have a chance to really grasp the material in their own time. So now that schools have really loosened up with these requirements, because they understand that, the virtual environment is different, we're suddenly now seeing kids who would otherwise be struggling do really, really well. For example, for kids who have executive function difficulties, teachers now having to put everything online so students can go and read them, as opposed to having to just hear it in class and then missing it, etc. Teachers are seeing what a huge difference it makes for kids. And so when you're able to see that this makes a difference for these kids who have these struggles, there's so many kids in that what we call gray area who are not necessarily severely enough impacted to qualify, for example, for an IEP or a learning disability, but who still have a lot of these challenges. And so teachers now seeing evidence of the fact that if they make these changes, it makes a huge difference and it benefits everybody, I think is going to be really important. And that's part of what, those of us who are in fields like special education, disability studies, et cetera, we've been saying that in neuroscience, for example, we have a saying, if you want to understand how a process works, see where it breaks down. And it's the same thing here. So when we are able to slow down learning and see how it happens for a student who learns differently, that's going to teach us a lot of information about how learning happens in general. So unfortunately, in our school system, we do generally think of, special education, it's all this extra money, all this extra funding. We don't look at it as an opportunity for all teachers, for all educators to learn, to become better educators and learners. And I think that that's a missed opportunity. And I say this every time with a family, every time we're in that really difficult, tense place of what feels like we're fighting the school system. I constantly remind them of that this is not just about you or what's happening right now. This is going to have an impact. Even if we lose this particular fight, this student is still going to leave their mark here, because there's no way that people are going to engage in that without their awareness coming to it.
Absolutely. And I know that this is also something that's important to you, Bibi, so that these students can be a gift to the teachers and the schools, but they can also be gifts to their parents and their own families. Right?
That's a whole other talk, but yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. But I am a big believer that things happen for a reason. And if you have a child who has these types of challenges, this is not a problem to be solved. This is them bringing something to your attention that you really need to look at in terms of your own growth, in terms of maybe your own past, your own childhood, and yourself as an adult and as a parent. That's the approach that I always try to take with families, because we have so much stigma that's associated with, even in the language, like disability, disorder. That's certainly not the way that I see it. And, we know now that neurodiversity is something that is necessary for our human society. Just because a student has trouble with reading, it doesn't mean that it's a reflection of their intelligence in any way. It's because they're brain is designed to bring forth something else that's really important for society. But, unfortunately, we live in a literate world, and we have to make sure that they know how to read. But it's really, I think, a big part of the conversation that's really important is just shifting our mindset about how we look at difference. Is it something that we see as problematic, as a pathology, as something to cure? Or do we look at it as, an expression of the diversity that exists and that is important to all of our functioning?
And Bibi, as you're talking and thinking about this idea that these students are a gift, that what can they teach us? What can they show us about systems or processes that may not just not be working for them, but may not be working in general for a whole bunch of students, or even for our education system or our society as a whole. And I think about any group that is a minority group, in the sense that most people are not like them. So it could be Black people, it could be other people of color. I mean, as women, we're actually 51% of the population, but we are considered a minority group, and that because we don't have the same power that men have. But if we think about that, when we oftentimes can see, we kind of like see the matrix, right? We see the system in a way that people in the majority group don't see it, because they're so embedded in the system. So we can challenge that status quo. And it's almost like the students are breaking the mold. And the mold really doesn't work for a lot of people, but they obviously break the mold, whereas a lot of other people try to kind of like fit themselves into it in school, but they don't quite fit. And I think about so many of our systems across our society where so many of us have tried to fit into this mold, and we kind of can fit. And so we struggle, and we think that everything is good enough, or it's our problem that we don't quite fit. But it's the people who really don't fit who actually do us a favor.
Well, I mean, I think, and for people who are maybe familiar with like critical studies, et cetera, there is such power in being outside, being an outsider, being outside the system, because you're able to then see and critique it in a way that you wouldn't be able to do if you're inside. It really is all about that perspective that you have, because you cannot, even if you wanted to, because I think all human beings we're tribal, social, beings, and we all want to fit. But when you absolutely cannot, that is where all the power lies, because then you have no choice but to stand out and kind of point out what you're seeing. Our education system, I think, is a really great example of this, because it is a system, is sort of based on this factory model that is for one particular purpose and very limited in terms of all the different abilities that human beings can bring to the picture. And so, but I think that, like you said, it applies to everything. So, for example, for me as a bicultural person, I think a lot of part of the reason why I'm so interested in working with this population is because, I grew up being in a system, but always being outside of it. And so that gives you a dual kind of perspective that you wouldn't otherwise have. How can you look at, how can you critique when you're inside of it? You can't. So I think that, in discussions around difference, we have to recognize the power and potential of being different. And we don't always do that.
Bibi, tell us a little bit more about your background growing up, because I find it really fascinating, and it does, and you can clearly see how it has informed the work that you do.
Sure. So I guess I would identify myself as an Iranian American. I was born in Iran and I grew up there. I was born the year of the revolution. So, the first 10 years of my life I spent in Iran, and it was a very, I guess, you would say it was a very anti-American environment in terms of what was going on in the politics of the country. But then at the same time, we all had family who lived in the US. I had uncles who'd lived here for years and years. And so it was already, even at that very young age, a very confusing duality to navigate. Because on the one hand, you're hearing all these negative things, and on the other hand, you are hearing different things, and that's not your experience. And then I moved to the US right around the time of the Gulf War. That was another experience of being here at a time where, it was a very sort of Middle East attitude here, and the experience of kind of being like, okay, well, I know, I hear what you guys are saying, but I've lived there and it's not like that. So I don't know what, this is different. So then of course, just being a first generation immigrant, just being a bicultural person automatically gives you a unique positionality and a unique lens. I think that's it's part of what makes me who I am. And I always take that, whether I like to or not, anything that I come to, I always come to it with a critical mindset. And sometimes that doesn't work to your advantage. And I always come to it kind of, when I sit, for example, at an IEP table, I feel that I have the ability to see it from the parent's point of view, the principal's point of view, the teacher's point of view, the child's point of view, my point of view, in a way that maybe others don't. And I think that having that kind of empathy can be really helpful in the type of work that I do. So yeah, I mean, I think that's another aspect of our society that we sometimes ignore. There's a lot of power in having lived in different and sometimes conflicting realities.
Yes, and I know that there are so many good arguments for why having immigrants in America. I mean, they have, there's economic arguments about people, immigrants who start businesses and things like that, which is all great. But I think it's the having a unique perspective, having this dual perspective is what adds so much to our American culture and helps us to improve things.
Right. I mean, I think that is the American culture, right? It's sort of having all of these different perspectives come in. Now, how that plays out is a different story, but it's a very unique place. It's a very unique place.
Indeed. Well, Bibi, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And thank you for indulging me and talking about your signature talk topic. I really wanted to just hear you talk about it again.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
Thank you again to Bibi for coming on the podcast. Be sure to connect with her on LinkedIn. The link to her profile is in the show notes. And you can also connect with me on LinkedIn if you haven't already. Until next time, thanks for listening.